Have you ever had an almost deja vu moment when the situation feels so familiar but the players are different? Or a gut feeling you ignore because it feels almost safe and comfortable because you've experienced it before, even though it's far from being safe? For me, the more I hid my authenticity and tried to fit in, the more the same patterns would repeat in my life. And it wasn't until I started to identify the similarities between the situations, including my early childhood, that I started to really understand why the same things were happening over and over again. Hi, I'm Charlie, and welcome back to TURTZED. I want to start with a huge thank you to everyone who listened to episode 1 and are back or joining us for the first time for episode 2. To say I was overwhelmed is an understatement. The love and support I received after the first episode truly blew my mind and warmed my heart. I literally got to dinner that night and could barely put 2 words together to place the order. And it's gotten me so excited and really ignited the fire in me to keep going. I'm so excited to dive further into authenticity with all of you. And it was definitely a Valentine's Day to remember. And I can't say that I've said that before. As a reminder, this podcast represents my opinions and my life experiences. I'm not a healthcare provider, and if there's anything that resonates in this episode and you want to explore it more, I recommend seeking out a healthcare or mental health professional. For more information, check out turtz.com/disclaimer. From an early age, I was pushed into the mold of what I should be instead of figuring out who I was. My father would often criticize me and say things like, "I liked your last haircut better," or after I worked all summer at my first job and saving up enough money to purchase my first pair of expensive sunglasses that I had my eyes on for this entire summer. And I was so proud of them. He handed me a pair of sunglasses in the car and said, "Try these on," meaning his. "They'll look better on you." This doesn't surprise me because when we would visit his parents, we had to comb our hair a certain way or wear the clothes that they deemed appropriate. Even if my father didn't directly express his disapproval, I always knew it was there. There was so much said with tone, facial expressions, and body language. Honestly, it was more of what wasn't being said than what was. Someone recently asked me this question as I was developing Turtz. They said, if you could go back in your life and you had the choice to repeat your trauma, would you? It stopped me dead in my tracks as I remembered the traumas I had experienced because they began to race through my mind. Before I could even answer the question, I had tears welling up in my eyes, and the tears were representative of the pain that I've been through. But I also started to think about the full picture. And as painful as it was at times, I would not be who I am today without all of my life's experiences. If we look at life as a pendulum and focus on the side it swings to when we're in pain, we can sometimes miss it swinging in the other direction. And frankly, the ability to read what's not being said and understand what people want and need has become my superpower as a coach. And I wouldn't have that gift without the pain I experienced in my childhood and even as an adult. I know this won't apply to every situation, but for me, I try to reflect on the entire picture to better understand my journey, and sometimes the most painful things can have duality and lead to something incredibly positive. And speaking of painful, let's talk about first dates. Have you ever been on a first date and been asked something like, "Do you like camping?" Have you ever lied to a question like this and said yes, only to realize that you'd have to, in this case, sleep in a tent and not shower for 2 days? Same. This is just a small version of changing yourself. And if we're honest, what would be so wrong with an answer of, "Camping hasn't been my thing in the past, but I'd be open to trying it again and see how it goes"? It's honest and vulnerable. It's also harder. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I hate camping, hiking, and going to sleep without a shower after physical activity, so you'd get a hard no from me. But hey, at least I could be authentic with this. Now, let's dive a little further into dating. Imagine now you're spending time with someone you're dating and really like. In my case, we were going out to dinner, we were going to brunch, and my birthday was coming up, so we decided to stay in and cook. Yes, I know, it was really fucking adorable. But wait, there's even more. So after making dinner, we cuddled up on the couch and he told me that he really liked me. And I was so excited because I felt similarly. Then he continued, but I could never introduce you to my parents with your pierced ears. As painful as it was to hear, frankly, I've heard worse. And it seemed easy enough to fix by taking him out. I problem solved that one real quick. But once again, he continued, or tell them what job you have. You'd have to have a real job. Not where you thought the story was going? Well, that is precisely how blindsided I felt in the moment. Even today, I feel like I have to justify this experience by telling you where I stood on the stacked ranking out of over 300 sales reps at that exact moment. Or the following month that I would become the number one salesperson in a national company. I was once again being told that my choices, the things that I loved, brought me happiness and that I was so proud of weren't good enough. So there I was in the moment, feeling like the floor had dropped out from underneath me, still trying to figure out how I could change myself to make this work and trying to imagine who I should be to match this person's desire of who he wanted me to be. Why did I keep trying to change myself? And why did I take this as a challenge to prove him wrong instead of just being the person that I was and move on? It wasn't just my personal life. Even at work, I never felt like I fit in. I never felt good enough. And I remember one quarterly business review that I did where I tried to put a sports reference in because everyone else was doing it. And I sure tried. I hilariously fumbled, sports pun intended, a 1-yard line reference with I was on the 99-yard line with respect to a deal that I was about to close. Everyone laughed and I was mortified. I could feel myself sink into the chair and just want to scream. I wanted the moment to be over, and it stuck with me that entire quarter. I wanted so badly to prove that moment wrong that quarter I did over 200% to my quota, and I decided that I had earned the right to be a little bit more authentic as if it was a transaction. Why did I feel like I couldn't be myself in the first place? Changing myself to fit in was far too familiar growing up. It felt like my father viewed me as an extension of himself because if I did what he wanted me to do or acted the way that worked for his vision of me, I would be praised, and therefore I personally would feel value. But it wouldn't last because if I didn't, being ignored would honestly have been a blessing. Instead, I'd be criticized and eviscerated. This is where I learned at a young age I needed to be what people wanted me to be, not who I was inside, in order to remain safe. I sacrificed parts of myself, I gave up on my interests and preferences to avoid not fitting into the mold, and this continued throughout my life, resulting in a tremendous amount of suppressed emotions. As I peeled back the layers in therapy, I realized that the conclusions I made about myself were based on the way I was spoken to and treated. The things I believed were that I had no control, I wasn't good enough, no one cared, no one believed me, and I wasn't safe. These limiting beliefs had me contorting and hiding myself in the hope that I would finally be cared for, good enough, and safe. My inauthenticity led me to experience these patterns over and over again. They came with the same result, and they became increasingly worse and more damaging. And to top it off, I made so many mistakes, one of which was pushing some amazing people away. I would cut them off at even the slightest sign of turbulence because I felt it was the only way to protect myself. I had outsized emotions for what would normally just be a bump in a relationship, and that would make it feel like the world was ending. I didn't communicate. I didn't share my feelings. I feared that the response I would get in return would be the exact same thing I experienced as a child. And I know I hurt people. I know I hurt people I cared for by doing this. And yet, when I was truly being hurt, I stayed for far too long and over-communicated like shouting into an empty cave. How fucked up is that? And this went on for years. And I am so thankful that after reflection and understanding my part in these failed relationships, I could truly be vulnerable, own my part, and apologize in order to rebuild some amazing friendships. And although I began to have a better understanding of my limiting beliefs and was trying to work through them and where they were rooted from, there was something that I couldn't put my finger on. There was something that was still holding me back. Have you ever thought about writing your name? Not just the letters, but what it means for you. What does it represent? What connections to your lineage does it hold? Does it bring you love? Does it bring you anger? Neither had I until I was in my 30s, when I was struggling to write my own name because it didn't feel like mine. It felt like a shadow lurking and a reminder of a life that I wished I could leave behind. There's a quote by William Shakespeare that I have my own personal interpretation of. The quote reads, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet." So if I changed my name to one I felt represented me and my authenticity, would it matter? Would it make a difference? Would it finally give me permission to show up more authentically? I guess for me, subconsciously, it took me out of the shadow and put me into the light. I wanted to start a new path with a name that I felt like fit me. The problem was, no one really knew who I was entirely, and neither did I. However, taking back control of my own name was more empowering than I could have even possibly imagined, and it helped me to continue down the path of finding my authenticity. After years of thinking about it and discussing it with a select few, I made the final decision to change my name. When selecting my last name, I thought about all of those questions I asked you earlier, and selected a name that represented and meant so much to me. I couldn't wait to tell my mom's parents because I knew it would mean a lot to them, but nothing could have prepared me for their response. My grandmother was absolutely elated with the news. She clapped her hands and held them in that interlocking hold with a huge smile on her face and said, "It's about time. I am so excited you're officially going to be a Turtz." If you knew my grandmother, you can picture exactly what that smile on her face looked like. Whenever I saw her, she would have that smile on her face, and you could feel the love and joy just beaming from her. I do have to tell you, I was also the first grandchild, and this created kind of a special bond between us. I loved to push her buttons and jokingly ask her if I was her favorite, to which she would always laugh. And to my family listening, as hard as I pressed, I never really got an answer, so we'll never know because she took that one to the grave. Now, my grandfather always had words, almost all of which came with a strong sense of protection. I always knew I was safe and that he had my back. In fact, even if I felt wronged and then got over it, he would continue to hold that protective grudge, and he took quite a few of those to the grave as well. So when I told him I changed my name, he was speechless. It was like he froze, and as I looked more closely, I realized that he had tears in his eyes. I'm not sure that I had ever seen tears from him before, and I don't think I ever saw them from him again. He held and supported all of us with his strength when we were struggling, and in this moment, I could see that he put that strong exterior aside and no words had to be shared. I knew exactly how he felt, and as it fully processed, he realized that I would have the same name as his father, Charles Turtz. And even to this day, I'm not sure which of us received the gift that day. I wish that conversation solidified my name change, but let me tell you, if you're not changing your name because you got married, the process is long and complicated to say the least. And so is telling the rest of my family. For those of you who don't know, I have a brother, and no, he's not my twin, but I will say guests at his wedding confused me for him. I love him more than anything, and yeah, it's weird to not have the same last name. It was a difficult moment and a very difficult conversation, and I am so thankful that that name change didn't affect anything in our relationship. In my struggle and sadness about having different last names, my brother was supportive and kind despite struggling himself in that moment. He understood my why and knew it had nothing to do with him, and he wanted me to find my own path in life. With my father, I tried to handle the conversation delicately, and I wanted, to the best of my ability, to handle the situation directly and not have him blindsided by by the information from someone else. Turns out it may have been better to stay silent, because I was met with the fury of this is the most hurtful thing you could do, and I would come to regret this. Yet, to the contrary, I haven't looked back. The gag of it all is the idea that I could have an identity outside of him and that this had nothing to do with him. It didn't seem to compute. It was as if I could never have an identity outside of being my father's son, and that it was wrong to make this choice for my happiness without putting him at the center of the decision. So after yelling at me and then calling my mom to enlist her to convince me not to do this, I had one of my first experiences with holding on to my authenticity and being unafraid to own it by continuing down the Turtz path. My father's reaction to my name change was actually ironic. It highlighted the fact that both a father and son, although for different reasons, each chose their own last name for their personal identities. You see, my father's mother remarried a man who also lost his partner when their collective 4 children were under the age of 5. When I was about 10 years old, I was learning about lineage, and I asked why we didn't have the same name as the rest of his side of the family. And my father explained to me that he chose to keep his biological father's name instead of taking the new family name to keep his own identity. There's a lot in here. And if I could leave you with one thing, it is to be kind and also find your authenticity. Be who you are, even if it's just updating your dating profile and taking out camping. Show up as who you are. It's so much more powerful and, frankly, a way more enjoyable way to live life. And as it turns out, it's not just for authenticity sometimes. You gotta have some fun with it too, because, well, have you met me? I'd do anything for a sale. So it turns out, when you start a job with one last name and a phone number from New York, yet a few years later, someone reaches out to you and you have a new last name and a phone number from Florida, it may be hard for that person to tell that they're talking to the same person. So, since I had access to both phone numbers and email addresses, what I thought was a clear response to their question, they thought was a handoff to a totally different employee in another state for their relocation. Honest to God, I spent the better part of a week having multiple conversations with someone who thought they were having 2 separate conversations with 2 separate Charlies. And to top it off, they continuously demanded to speak to Charles Turtz's supervisor, who they believed was New York Charlie with my original last name, because they didn't like the answers they were getting. But surprise, they got the same answer from my supervisor because it was still me. There's so much more to come as we get started with interviews and come to discuss more experiences and patterns created in the reach for authenticity. If there's a topic you want to hear, DM me on Instagram at TURTZED or head over to turtzed.com/thepodcast and let me know what you want to hear more about. Thank you for following along with me today, and I cannot wait for next week. I'm still deciding between 2 topics, so it's going to be just as big of a surprise for me as it will be for all of you, but I can safely say you will not want to miss either one.